2 decades ago, my wife stood in our living room, staring down at our 4-year-old boy as he rocked rhythmically in the corner. She flatly told me she refused to bury her youth and her future in a bottomless pit of silence. She packed a single, designer-red suitcase, stepped over his scattered wooden blocks, and marched out the front door without ever casting a glance backward. She abandoned me with a failing auto repair shop, a mountain of suffocating debt, and a nonverbal child whom doctors claimed would likely never live an independent life. I raised him alone. Every single night, I scrubbed the harsh motor grease from my calloused hands just so I could hold him close when the noise of the world became too overwhelming for him. I battled tooth and nail for every therapy session, every sensory toy, and every special education accommodation. Then, the absolute miracle occurred. The silence that his mother had so deeply despised blossomed into brilliant colors. At 14, his very first canvas sold for $500. Yesterday, at 24 years old, one of his massive abstract pieces auctioned for $1.8 million. And exactly 3 hours after the auctioneer's gavel struck the wood, she returned. But she didn't come alone. She brought a high-priced lawyer, a slick new husband, and a ruthless lawsuit demanding full legal conservatorship over the exact same son she had thrown away. I told my lawyer to prepare for absolute war. I swore we would burn every last dime to ash before she ever touched a single penny. But my son, the boy who used to cower under the kitchen table whenever the telephone rang, placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and whispered the most terrifying thing I have ever heard in my life. Let me handle it. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 68 years old, and my hands are permanently scarred from 40 years of turning heavy wrenches and changing dirty oil. I'm a simple, blue-collar man who learned the hard way that blood does not equate to family. Showing up does. Before I detail exactly how a quiet, autistic artist utterly dismantled a pack of greedy wolves without ever raising his voice, I want to know where you are listening from. Let me know in the comments. And please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. If you have ever had to shield someone you love from a toxic person who falsely claimed to love them. The air inside the upscale gallery reeked of expensive designer perfume and cold, hard cash. It was a suffocating scent I never truly got used to, even after Julian became the undisputed darling of the New York art scene. I lingered in the back near the glowing exit sign, uncomfortably tugging at the collar of a rented tuxedo that felt more like a straitjacket. My hands, still bearing the embedded grime of decades of engine work, were shoved deep into my pockets. I was completely out of my element, surrounded by elite socialites who spent more on a single handbag than I used to earn in a whole year, but I wasn't paying attention to them. My eyes were locked on my son. Julian sat in the front row, wearing his essential noise-canceling headphones. He was 24 now, a strikingly handsome young man who inherited my broad shoulders but possessed his mother's sharp, high cheekbones. He was rocking slightly, moving to a rhythm only his mind could process, his long, artistic fingers tapping a silent, complex code against his knee. To the wealthy crowd in the room, he was a mysterious, eccentric genius, the savant of abstract color. To me, he was just Jules, the sweet boy who would only eat grilled cheese sandwiches if they were cut into perfect triangles, and absolutely needed every tag carefully snipped out of his shirts. Sitting right beside him was Claire, my fierce daughter-in-law, a brilliant woman with a spine forged from solid titanium. She was gently whispering something to him, likely counting down the minutes until they could escape the crowds and go home. She was the only other person in the world who understood that Julian couldn't care less about the glamorous gala or the fame. He simply wanted to return to the quiet sanctuary of his studio and paint. The auctioneer, a man possessing a voice like polished brass, aimed his gavel toward a wealthy bidder in the upper balcony. Going once, at $1.7 million. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I glanced at Claire. She gave Julian's hand a reassuring squeeze. He didn't physically react. He was entirely captivated by the dust motes dancing through the intense beam of the spotlight. Going twice. The tension in the gallery was so thick you could choke on it. This was the monumental sale that would permanently change our reality. This was the ultimate financial security I had desperately prayed for during those grueling nights when I was repairing busted radiators at 3:00 a.m. just to afford Julian's vital speech therapy. This was his guaranteed future. Sold for $1.8 million to the gentleman on the phone. The gavel cracked against the podium. The sharp sound echoed like a triumphant gunshot, signaling our ultimate victory. The room erupted in polite, wealthy applause. Camera flashbulbs began popping aggressively like a fireworks display. Claire leaped up and wrapped her arms around Julian. He stiffened slightly at the sudden contact, but he allowed it because he trusted her completely. I exhaled a heavy, trembling breath that I felt like I had been holding in my lungs since 1994. We had actually done it. My boy was safe. He was financially secure for the rest of his life. I began to weave my way through the wealthy crowd toward them, a massive, proud grin stretching across my aging face. I desperately wanted to tell him that we could finally buy that secluded house with the large skylights he admired so much. I wanted to promise him he would never, ever have to worry about surviving again. But then the heavy double doors at the main entrance of the gallery didn't just casually open. They were violently shoved so hard they slammed against the walls. The polite applause instantly died down, fading into a confused, murmuring silence. Heads swiveled. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. Standing perfectly framed in the doorway, illuminated by the city streetlights behind her, was Evelyn. She looked drastically different from the exhausted woman who had walked out on us 2 decades prior. The cheap, faded denim jacket was long gone, replaced by a luxurious fur coat that looked like it cost more than my first garage. Her hair was chemically straightened and dyed a brilliant honey blonde. Her face was pulled tight, clearly maintained by expensive surgeries and elite creams. But I instantly recognized those eyes, cold, highly calculating, and deeply predatory. She wasn't alone. On her left stood a man in a shiny, sharkskin suit, scanning the wealthy room with hungry, desperate eyes. That had to be Marcus, the flashy day trader she had left me for, or perhaps the newest one in a long line. On her right stood a serious-looking man carrying a thick leather briefcase, wearing the exact kind of tailored suit that screamed aggressive billable hours. My stomach plummeted to the floor. I frantically tried to push forward to place my body between her and Julian, but the crowd of socialites was too dense. Evelyn's predatory eyes locked onto Julian in the front row. Her facial expression instantly and flawlessly transformed. She no longer looked like an uninvited interloper crashing an elite event. She suddenly looked like a tragic, weeping mother reuniting with her long-lost child in a dramatic movie scene. It was a sickening, twisted, Oscar-worthy performance. She ran. She actually sprinted down the center aisle, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the polished concrete floor. "My baby!" she shrieked. Her voice was painfully shrill, violently slicing through the sophisticated, quiet murmur of the gallery. "Oh God, my precious baby boy!" "No," I roared, aggressively shoving a waiter out of my path. "Do not touch him." But I was too far away and she was far too fast. Julian was still wearing his heavy noise-canceling headphones. He didn't hear her frantic approach. He was deep in his safe internal zone, mathematically processing the bright lights and color patterns. He didn't perceive the incoming threat until her arms were already violently wrapping around his body. She grabbed him forcefully from behind, burying her face into his neck, sobbing with theatrical loudness. For an autistic individual suffering from severe sensory processing disorder, an unexpected, aggressive physical touch isn't just an annoyance. It translates to genuine physical agony. It feels like a high-voltage electric shock. It is a literal bomb detonating inside their delicate nervous system. Julian didn't merely flinch. He absolutely exploded. He let out a guttural, primal scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that completely shattered the refined atmosphere of the gallery. He violently leaped up, knocking his heavy chair backward to the floor. He flailed his arms wildly in a desperate attempt to scrape the agonizing sensation of her touch off his skin. His swinging hand connected hard with her face in a frantic, defensive slap. Evelyn went down hard. She collapsed to the floor in a dramatic heap of expensive fur and fake tears, dramatically clutching her cheek. Julian scrambled backward until his back hit the gallery wall. He slid down to the floor, curling his large frame into a tight, defensive ball, pressing his hands brutally hard over his ears and rocking violently. He began striking the side of his own head with his clenched fists. Thump, thump, thump. He was desperately attempting to regulate the sudden, agonizing chaos erupting in his brain, trying to physically beat out the traumatic invasion of his personal space. "Get the hell away from him," I bellowed, finally shoving my way through the tight circle of stunned, whispering onlookers. I aggressively planted my body between my terrified son and the woman performing on the floor. Claire was already on her knees next to Julian. She didn't make the mistake of trying to grab or hold him. She knew much better than that. She simply used her own body to create a physical barrier, shielding him from the aggressive glare of the flashing cameras, and began rhythmically whispering a mathematical counting sequence he utilized to ground himself. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. Her voice was remarkably steady, acting as a sturdy lighthouse in the middle of a terrifying hurricane. Evelyn remained on the floor. She slowly looked up, and I clearly saw the bright flashes of the reporter's cameras reflecting in her cold eyes. She knew exactly where every single lens was positioned. She didn't spare a single glance at Julian, who was currently hyperventilating in agony against the wall because of her actions. She didn't ask if her son was physically okay. She looked directly at the greedy reporters. "They kept him from me," she wailed loudly, fake tears streaming down her tightened face with impressive practiced speed. "Look at what they did to my beautiful boy. They turned him into a wild animal. I am his mother. I am here to finally save him." The man in the sharkskin suit, Marcus, stepped forward, helping her to her feet with exaggerated, gentle care. He aggressively pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "You people should be absolutely ashamed of yourselves," he shouted loudly, ensuring the entire room heard him. "Keeping a loving mother away from her severely disabled child. We are taking him home with us tonight." The lawyer with the briefcase stepped smoothly forward, holding up a thick manila envelope. "We have obtained a temporary emergency custody order," he announced, his voice smooth, professional, and deadly. "Pending a full competency hearing, Mrs. Evelyn Vance Sterling is asserting her legal biological rights." I stood frozen, my fists clenched so incredibly hard that my scarred knuckles turned a pale gray. I could hear Julian whimpering in sheer terror behind me. I could see Claire's eyes burning with a protective rage that perfectly matched my own. But what I focused on most clearly were Evelyn's eyes. She wasn't looking at Julian, who was actively suffering a brutal meltdown directly caused by her intense selfishness. She wasn't looking at me, the loyal man she had betrayed and left with nothing. She was looking right past us. She was staring directly at the wooden easel positioned on the main stage. She was staring hungrily at the red sticker that proudly read "Sold." She was staring at the massive number, $1, 8 million, written boldly on the display board. She didn't see a human son. She saw a winning lottery ticket. I took a threatening step forward, my mechanic's chest heaving heavily, fully prepared to tear Marcus's head off his shoulders right there in front of the entire New York elite. I didn't care about potential jail time. I didn't care about the media scandal. Claire quickly grabbed my ankle from the floor. I looked down at her. She shook her head once, sharp, quick, and commanding. "Not here," she mouthed silently. I looked back at Evelyn. She was actively smiling through her fake crocodile tears, openly basking in the bright flashes of the cameras. She truly believed she had already won. She thought the perfect script was already written. The wealthy, concerned mother returning just in time to rescue her helpless, wealthy child from an angry, aggressive, blue-collar father. She had absolutely no idea that she had just proudly strutted into a devastating trap. But as I looked down at my son, still rocking and crying on the hard floor, I knew the ultimate cost of this impending war was going to be drastically higher than the price of any painting, and I was completely ready to pay it. The next morning, the bright sun hit our worn kitchen table, but it brought absolutely no warmth. The usual silence in our modest house was peaceful, a highly comfortable quiet where Julian could peacefully eat his morning oatmeal and meticulously organize his fresh blueberries by exact size. Today, however, the silence felt incredibly heavy. It felt exactly like the oppressive, thick air right before a violent thunderstorm breaks. Claire was blankly staring at her ceramic coffee cup, her knuckles stark white as she gripped the handle. Julian was rocking back and forth in his wooden chair, moving much harder and faster than usual, a low, anxious hum continuously vibrating deep in his throat. He sensed the severe tension. He always sensed the danger long before we did. When the front doorbell rang sharply at 8:00 a.m., it did not sound like a friendly visitor. It sounded like an air raid warning. I slowly wiped the grease from my hands onto a kitchen towel and walked heavily to the door. I knew exactly who it was before my hand even touched the knob. A beau. Red-looking man in a cheap, wrinkled suit stood on the porch holding a thick, legal envelope. He didn't even bother to look me in the eye. He just rapidly mumbled my name, shoved the heavy papers hard into my chest, and walked away as fast as his legs could carry him. I closed the door and ripped open the envelope right there in the narrow hallway. The very first bold word my eyes locked onto was conservatorship. I am just a mechanic. I know exactly how to fix a busted transmission, and I know how to completely rebuild a dead engine block. I certainly did not go to a fancy law school, but I knew exactly what that specific legal word meant. It meant total slavery. It meant that Evelyn wasn't merely asking the courts for a cut of the money. She was asking for the absolute legal right to become Julian's brain. She wanted the unmitigated right to dictate where he lived, who he was allowed to see, what he ate, and how he spent every single dime he ever earned. She was aggressively arguing that Julian was a fully incapacitated adult, and that I, his elderly, blue-collar father with only a high school education, was completely unfit to manage a complex estate now worth millions. My hands began to violently shake, not from any kind of fear, but from a rage so intensely hot it felt like I had swallowed a firing piston. She wanted to legally reduce my son into a piece of manageable property. I walked heavily back into the kitchen and threw the thick stack of papers onto the table. Claire snatched them up. She rapidly read the first page, and I physically watched the color rapidly drain from her face. She looked over at Julian, who was currently lining up his daily vitamins into a perfect, unwavering straight line. "She wants full, absolute control," Claire whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. "She is legally claiming emergency jurisdiction. She is telling the court that you are manipulating his mind. She is claiming that I am just a gold-digging opportunist. She wants to forcefully move him to a residential facility for psychological evaluation." "That is just a fancy, legal word for a locked institution," I growled, my voice incredibly low and highly dangerous. "Over my dead body." 2 hours later, we were sitting anxiously in the upscale office of Mr. Adler. Adler was incredibly expensive, deeply cynical, and had been aggressively practicing law since before I was even born. His office smelled heavily of old, cracked leather and expensive cigar smoke. He silently read the emergency motion Evelyn's high-priced lawyers had filed. He read it agonizingly slowly, turning every single page with a dry, deliberate finger. The dry sound of the paper turning was the only noise in the tense room. Finally, he removed his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Arthur," he said, looking at me with incredibly tired eyes, "this is very, very bad. They have successfully filed in probate court. They are painting a highly specific, damaging picture. They are telling the judge you are a 70-year-old, retired, uneducated mechanic with a bad heart condition. They are stating that Julian has the mental capacity of a toddler. They are legally arguing that, suddenly, with this massive influx of cash, he is incredibly vulnerable to extreme fraud. And specifically, they are pointing the finger directly at you and Claire. I slammed my heavy, scarred hand down onto his pristine mahogany desk. The expensive wood actually groaned under the force. "Let them point," I shouted, shooting up from my chair. "Let them point their damn fingers. Where were those fingers 20 years ago? You ask them that, Adler. You ask the damn court where Evelyn was when Julian was 4 years old, sitting in his own waste, crying for his mother." Adler held up a calming hand. "Arthur, please listen to me. The court does not care about 20 years ago. The court solely cares about the safety of the financial assets right now." "I don't give a damn about the assets," I roared. "I care about the truth. She says I am unfit. She wrote in that legal filing that I am uneducated. You tell that judge I completely sold my shop. Tell him that. Tell him I sold Vance Auto Repair, the only damn thing my late father ever left me, because the health insurance flat out refused to cover Julian's speech therapy. Tell him I spent 10 brutal years working double shifts at a generic lube shop, coming home every night with motor oil embedded into my skin so deeply I couldn't scrub it out, just so I could pay for a private, specialized tutor, because the public school system completely gave up on him." I paced aggressively around the small, expensive office, my chest heaving with exertion. "She left a sticky note, Adler. She didn't even bother to say goodbye to him. She left a note on the damn refrigerator that said she refused to bury her life in a hole of silence. That is exactly what she called our boy, a hole. And now she suddenly wants to be his legal guardian. Now she wants the power to decide if he's even allowed to buy a paintbrush." Adler watched my outburst, his face completely unmoving. "I know that, Arthur, and you know that, but in the blind eyes of the law she is the biological mother. She now has a husband with a strong finance background. She has a massive team of elite lawyers, and she has a highly compelling narrative. They are going to argue you are holding him back from his potential. They are going to claim you are intentionally isolating him." He picked up a piece of paper from the thick file. "They even have a sworn statement here from your neighbor claiming you regularly shout at Julian, claiming your house is an unsafe environment." I let out a bitter, harsh laugh. "That is probably old Walter Higgins. He never, ever forgave me for refusing to completely rebuild his transmission for free." "It does not matter if it is true," Adler said sharply, leaning forward. "It only matters that it is officially in the file. We are currently fighting a brutal war of public and legal perception. And right now, on paper, you look like a highly angry, overwhelmed, violent old man. And she looks like a deeply concerned, wealthy mother stepping in to save the day." I sank back down into the chair, feeling the frantic adrenaline drain completely out of me. "So, what exactly do we do?" "We fight," Adler said firmly. "But this is not a street fist fight, Arthur. You absolutely cannot punch your way out of this probate court. This is a calculated siege. They are going to try to completely starve you out. They have officially asked the judge for a temporary freeze on all financial assets belonging to the Vance Trust until the competency hearing." I frowned, confusion cutting through my anger. "What does that mean?" "It means," Adler said, intertwining his fingers, "that as of 8:00 a.m. this morning, Julian's bank accounts are legally locked. The $1.8 million from the auction sale yesterday is trapped in escrow. You cannot touch a single cent of it. You cannot spend a dollar of it." I quickly looked over at Claire. She was frantically checking her smartphone under the edge of the table. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with sheer panic. "Arthur," she whispered. "What is it?" I asked. Claire slowly turned her phone screen toward me. It was her personal banking app. There was a massive red banner glaring across the top of the screen, "Account frozen." "It's not just the Art Trust," she said, her voice shaking violently. It is our personal joint account, the one we use to buy groceries, the one we use to pay the electric bill. They froze absolutely everything. I snapped my head back to Adler. Can they legally do that? Adler nodded grimly. If their lawyers successfully argue that you have commingled personal funds with the trust, or that you might attempt to flee the state with the money, yes, they can freeze it all pending a forensic financial audit. Suddenly, my cell phone rang in my pocket. It was a sharp, highly intrusive sound. I pulled it out. It was the wealthy owner of the gallery in Chelsea, the exact same man who had vigorously shaken my hand just yesterday and proudly called me a visionary father. I answered it. Mr. Vance. His voice was incredibly cold now, completely different from yesterday's warmth. I am calling regarding the rental fee for next month's major exhibition. The payment was scheduled to clear this morning, but the transfer was officially declined. I tightly closed my eyes. There must just be a banking mistake, I said, desperately trying to keep my voice steady. There is no mistake, he replied coldly. We received a highly aggressive legal notice from a firm representing Mrs. Evelyn Sterling. They have strictly instructed us that any future payments made to you or your daughter-in-law will be legally considered aiding and abetting in the embezzlement of a protected person's estate. Mr. Vance, I run a highly public business. I absolutely cannot get involved in a messy family feud. If the funds are not cleared by 5:00 p.m. today, we will have to permanently cancel the show and remove all of Julian's pieces from the floor. He hung up the phone before I could say another word. I stared blankly at the dark phone screen. My son had just sold a painting for nearly $2 million. On paper, we were incredibly rich. On paper, we were massively successful. But sitting in that dark office, surrounded by the smell of old cigars and feeling the immense weight of the law crushing down on our chests, I realized the terrifying, absolute truth. We were standing directly on top of a gold mine, but we literally could not afford to buy a loaf of bread. Evelyn knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just trying to win a legal argument in court. She was actively trying to break us. She knew I had absolutely no retirement savings. She knew we lived paycheck to paycheck until this massive sale. She was going to financially squeeze us until we couldn't breathe, until we had to come crawling back to her on our knees just to keep the lights on in our house. I looked at Claire. She wasn't crying anymore. She was typing furiously on her phone screen. "What are you doing?" I asked gently. "I am canceling the catering for the celebration dinner," she said, her voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. "And I am listing my car for sale online right now." I quickly reached out and stopped her hand. "No," I said firmly, "you love that car." "We need cash, Arthur," she said, looking me directly in the eye with fierce determination. "We need cash for food. We need cash for Julian's expensive medication. And we need cash to pay Mr. Adler." I looked at Adler. He didn't say anything, but he certainly didn't offer to work the case pro bono either. I stood up and walked heavily to the window. Down on the busy street, people were casually walking to lunch. They looked so incredibly normal. They had absolutely no idea that an entire life could be utterly dismantled in a single morning with just a few pieces of stamped paper. I thought about Julian. He was probably at home right now, deeply focused on painting. He didn't know that his entire world was being fenced in. He didn't know that his biological mother, the woman who abandoned him, was now weaponizing his own incredible success to build a cage around him. I pressed my forehead against the cool window glass. I felt the deep anger settling firmly in my gut, heavy and incredibly cold like a stone. "Let them freeze the damn money," I said quietly, turning back to face them. "Let them lock the doors. I survived on generic peanut butter and tap water for 5 years after she originally left. I can easily do it again." Adler filed the objection immediately. "Claire, do not sell your car yet. I have a secret stash of cash hidden in an old coffee can out in the garage that I saved for absolute emergencies. It is not much, but it will buy us groceries in time for a week." You honestly think you can outlast them? Adler asked, raising a highly skeptical eyebrow. They have millions in corporate backing. You have a coffee can. I am not trying to outlast them, I said, forcefully grabbing my coat. I'm just trying to buy enough time for them to make a critical mistake. Evelyn is incredibly greedy, and greedy people always get careless. We just need to be perfectly ready when she finally slips. I walked out of that expensive office with my head held high, but inside I was deeply terrified. We were at war, and the enemy had just expertly cut off all our supply lines. But I didn't know it then. The financial freeze was merely the opening shot. The real weapon was about to be fired, and it wasn't aimed at my bank account. It was aimed at the one vital thing that held our fragile family together. It was aimed directly at Claire. The television in our living room was usually strictly reserved for watching baseball games and the local evening news. But that Tuesday night, it became a glowing portal to hell. Claire sat perched on the very edge of the sofa, nervously biting her fingernail until it actively bled. I stood rigidly by the window, staring out at the dark street, gripping a glass of iced tea so tightly my hand violently cramped. On the screen, Evelyn sat elegantly in a beige armchair opposite a highly famous talk show host whose entire specialty was destroying reputations for daytime ratings. The studio lighting was incredibly soft, purposefully designed to make her look angelic and victimized. She delicately dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. The bold caption scrolling at the bottom of the screen read, "The mother who was forced to run." I listened in absolute horror as the woman who had abandoned my son 20 years ago completely rewrote history in real time. She told the sympathetic host that I was a highly violent, raging alcoholic. She explicitly claimed, "I used to come home, and Arthur would smell of cheap whiskey and motor grease, actively looking for a fight." She tearfully told a horrific story about how I allegedly threw a heavy wrench at her head while she was holding baby Julian. It was a lie so incredibly specific and so deeply vile that I felt the stomach bile rise in my throat. I have not touched a single drop of liquor since 1995, precisely because I needed to be completely sober and alert for Julian. I had never, ever raised a hand to her. I worshipped the very ground she walked on right up until the exact day she walked out. But the studio audience did not know any of that. They gasped loudly on cue. They shook their heads in extreme disgust. The host leaned in with highly practiced empathy and gently asked why she left her disabled son behind if I was truly so dangerous. Evelyn looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes perfectly wet. She was delivering the performance of a lifetime. "I did not leave him," she whispered, her voice trembling flawlessly. "I escaped. I had to get away just to survive. And once I was finally gone, Arthur threatened to severely hurt Julian if I ever came back. He held my own son hostage. He explicitly told me he would dump him in a state institution if I ever tried to contact them. So I stayed away. I stayed away purely to protect my boy. And now that he is an adult, I am finally strong enough to come back and save him." The audience completely erupted in applause. They loudly cheered for her supposed bravery. They cheered for the exact same woman who had left a 4-year-old child rocking in his own waist because she wanted to go party in Miami with a flashy day trader. I looked down at the glass in my hand. Without even thinking, I squeezed. The thick glass violently shattered, sharp shards slicing deeply into my palm. I did not feel the pain. I only felt the warm trickle of my own blood mixing with the cold tea, dripping steadily onto the carpet. Claire jumped up in a panic and ran to the kitchen to grab a towel. I just stared blankly at the screen. She had successfully turned me into a monster. In 20 short minutes, she had entirely erased 20 years of my sacrifice. She had taken every single night I stayed up holding Julian through a burning fever, and every single weekend I spent working exhausting extra shifts to pay for his sensory toys, and she completely twisted it into a horrific story of abuse. I aggressively turned off the TV, but the heavy silence that followed was so much worse. I knew exactly what was coming next. You cannot broadcast a lie that massive to 10 million people and expect nothing to happen. The very next morning, the entire world was different. It started with a low, threatening hum outside like a swarm of angry bees. I was standing in the kitchen, tightly bandaging my sliced hand when I heard it. I looked out the front window. There were angry people standing on my lawn, complete strangers. They were holding up signs. Some of them were homemade, scrawled aggressively with thick markers. Save Julian. Arrest the abuser. Free the artist. I saw a young woman with bright blue hair holding her smartphone up, actively live-streaming herself as she screamed curses at my house. I saw large men who looked like they were actively looking for a physical fight. But worse than the strangers, I saw my actual neighbors, people I had fixed cars for, people I had waived expensive labor costs for when they were tight on cash. They were standing comfortably on their porches, just watching. They were not intervening. They were waiting to see if the monster from TV was real. "We have to get Julian to the studio," Claire said, running frantically into the room. She was completely pale. "He has a strict deadline. If he does not finish the commission piece by Friday, we are in breach of contract, and he desperately needs his routine. Arthur, if he stays here with all this noise, he will completely fall apart." She was right. Strict routine was oxygen for Julian. We rapidly grabbed his noise-canceling headphones and his heavy-weighted blanket. We moved quickly and efficiently, like seasoned soldiers in an active war zone. I opened the front door, and the massive wall of sound hit us instantly. "Coward!" the angry crowd screamed. I tightly put my arm around Julian's shoulders, keeping his head pointed down. Claire walked closely on his other side, physically shielding him with her body. We moved toward the old, beat-up sedan parked in the driveway. It was only a distance of 20 feet, but it felt like 100 miles. Suddenly, something wet and heavy forcefully hit my shoulder. I looked down. It was a raw egg, sliding messily down my jacket, leaving a gross trail of yellow slime. Then another one violently hit the car window. Then a balloon filled with bright red paint exploded against the front door of the house, looking exactly like a gruesome blood splatter. "Murderer!" someone shouted from the crowd. Julian stopped moving. He froze right there in the dead center of the driveway. I felt his entire body stiffen rigidly under my arm. To him, this was not just loud noise. It was a violent physical assault. The angry shouting, the impacts, the foul smell of the eggs, the intense visual chaos of the waving signs, it was all way too much. His brain was desperately trying to process everything at once, and it was catastrophically overloading. "Come on, move," I pleaded, desperately trying to physically guide him. "Son, please get in the car." But he could not hear me. He started to hum, a highly distressed, high-pitched keening sound that completely tore at my heart. He forcefully covered his ears with his hands, pressing inward so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Claire quickly opened the back door of the car. "Get him in, Arthur," she screamed over the deafening noise of the mob. I gently tried to push him, but he was complete dead weight. He was 6 feet tall and incredibly strong Rom working with heavy canvases. When he planted his feet, he was immovable like an oak tree. A small rock was thrown and hit the pavement directly near his foot. He flinched violently, and then he completely broke. He dropped heavily to his knees on the hard concrete. He didn't care about the wet paint, the broken glass, or the screaming crowd. He curled into a tight, defensive ball, burying his head deep in his knees. The humming abruptly turned into a full-blown scream. It was a horrific sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound of a fragile soul being ripped apart. He started violently hitting himself. This is the dark part of autism that people do not talk about on their cheerful inspiration blogs. When the sensory overload gets incredibly high, the internal pain has to go somewhere. Julian slammed his open palms against the sides of his own head incredibly hard. Once, twice, thrice. "Stop it, Jules," I shouted, completely dropping to my knees beside him. I totally ignored the angry crowd. I ignored the dozens of camera phones actively recording us. I firmly wrapped my thick arms around my son, desperately trying to pin his flailing arms to his sides. I had to stop him from severely hurting himself. He aggressively fought me. He was fully panicked and incredibly strong. He thrashed backward and his sharp elbow caught me squarely in the jaw. I instantly tasted hot blood, but I did not let go. I squeezed him even tighter, using my entire body weight to press him safely into the ground. Claire was right there, too. She was openly crying, but she was actively working. She draped the heavy weighted blanket over his head, effectively creating a dark, safe cocoon. She placed her hands firmly on his back, rubbing in intense, firm circular motions. "Deep pressure," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Deep pressure, Jules, you are safe. You are a rock. You are an island." We stayed locked like that on the hard driveway for 10 agonizing minutes. A 68-year-old man and a young woman actively wrestling a grown man on the concrete, while a mob of angry strangers cheered and jeered at us. They genuinely thought I was actively attacking him. I could hear them screaming, "Look, he is hurting him right now." They had absolutely no idea I was hugging him for his dear life. They didn't know that every single time he hit himself, it hurt my soul 1,000 times more. They just saw a villain violently restraining a victim. I saw my little boy, who was still terrified of the dark, desperately trying to beat the scary, overwhelming noises out of his own head. Eventually, the intense fight slowly went out of him. The weighted blanket successfully did its work. The total darkness calmed his firing neurons. He went completely limp against my chest, sobbing very quietly. I looked up at the crowd. My face was completely wet with tears, sweat, and blood. The crowd had quieted down just a little bit, but only so they could get better audio for their viral videos. I looked directly at the girl with the blue hair who was still actively filming. I looked her right in the eye. "Are you happy now?" I whispered, my voice incredibly raw. "Is this exactly what you wanted?" We finally managed to get him safely into the backseat of the car. Claire drove. I sat in the back with Julian, tightly holding his shaking hand. He was staring blankly at nothing, his eyes completely empty and utterly exhausted. I looked out the back window as we quickly drove away. My house, the house I had worked my entire life to pay off, was completely covered in bright red paint and broken eggs. The word monster was spray-painted in thick black letters across my garage door. Evelyn had not just viciously attacked my reputation. She had utterly destroyed the safe sanctuary I built specifically for my son. She had effectively turned his safe haven into an active war zone. And looking closely at Julian's badly bruised forehead where he had struck himself, I fully realized this was no longer a standard legal dispute. This was not about the money anymore. This was a character assassination attempt. She was actively trying to kill his spirit because she fully knew that was the only possible way to break the tight bond between us. I wiped the blood from my busted lip. I looked at Claire's eyes in the rearview mirror. They were incredibly hard, like striking flint. "Call Adler," I said quietly. "Tell him to stop playing defense. Tell him I want to attack." "Arthur, we have absolutely no money," Claire said gently. "I do not care," I replied. "We are going to find a way. Evelyn wants a villain. Fine. I will be the ultimate villain. But she is going to learn the hard way that you do not ever corner a desperate mechanic who has absolutely nothing left to lose." I touched the bloody bandage on my hand where the shattered glass had cut me. The sharp pain was very real. It was the only thing actively keeping me totally focused. We were going to hit back, and we were going to hit back incredibly hard. The very last weapon left in my depleted arsenal was the absolute truth. And the truth lived in a crumbling, sad brick house on East 42nd Street. I drove my beat-up sedan through the rough neighborhood where Julian grew up. It was a depressing place where the street lights constantly flickered and massive potholes swallowed tires whole, but it was the absolute only place where people actually knew the real story. I was looking for Walter Higgins. He was 80 years old now. He was the man who had lived directly next door to us for 15 long years. He was physically there the exact day Evelyn walked out. He personally saw her confidently drag that red suitcase down the driveway while Julian screamed hysterically in the front window. He was the very one who brought over a warm casserole that first horrific night because he knew I didn't know how to cook. If anyone on earth could clear my name, it was Walter. I pulled up to his house. The cheap paint was peeling badly, and the front porch sagged dangerously on the left side. I walked heavily up the steps, feeling a deep heaviness in my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with my bad heart condition. Walter was sitting in his worn rocking chair, just like he always did. He looked incredibly frail. His eyes were milky with advanced age, but he smiled warmly when he saw me approach. "Arthur," he said, his voice cracking like dry autumn leaves, "I saw you on the news. They are saying some truly terrible things about you." I sat down heavily on the wooden railing. "It is all lies, Walter," I said. "You were there. You know exactly what happened. You know she left us." He nodded slowly. I remember that sweet boy crying. I remember you working 2 grueling jobs. You were a remarkably good father, Arthur. You were the absolute best father that boy could have ever asked for." I felt a massive lump form in my throat. I desperately needed to hear that more than I realized. "I need your help, Walter," I said softly. "I need you to tell the lawyers what you saw. I need you to officially testify that I didn't ever abuse him." Walter looked down at his wrinkled hands. They were trembling slightly. He rubbed his bony knuckles. "I don't know, Arthur. I am very old. I don't like courts or lawyers." "Please, Walter," I begged. "They are going to legally take him away from me. They are going to lock him in a home." He looked up at me then. There was something very strange in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. It looked a lot like fear, but it also looked remarkably like deep shame. He took a long, deep breath. "Okay," he said softly. I will tell them the truth." I drove home feeling a tiny spark of genuine hope. It was incredibly fragile, but it was there. I immediately called Adler and told him to quickly set up the deposition. I told Claire that we finally had a star witness. I genuinely thought the tide was finally turning. I was an absolute fool. I should have known that in a brutal war over millions of dollars, loyalty is just another cheap commodity that can be easily bought and sold. The tense deposition took place 2 days later in the sterile conference room of a high-rise building downtown. The room was freezing and lacked any warmth. The walls were all glass. The massive table was polished mahogany that looked exactly like a sheet of black ice. A videographer stood silently in the corner with a camera pointed aggressively at the witness chair. Evelyn was there, sitting comfortably next to Marcus. She wasn't even looking at me. She was casually looking at her smartphone, scrolling through social media like she was just waiting for a nail appointment. Marcus was annoyingly drumming his fingers on the table, staring at me with an arrogant smirk that made me want to reach violently across the table and choke the life out of him. Walter was slowly brought in by a paralegal. He looked incredibly small in the massive leather chair. He was wearing an old suit that was 2 sizes too big for him, probably the one he bought specifically for funerals. He absolutely wouldn't look at me. He kept his milky eyes fixed entirely on the glass water pitcher in the center of the table. Adler started the questioning. He was incredibly gentle. He asked Walter about his background, about how long he had lived next to us. Walter answered in nervous monosyllables, "Yes, no, 20 years." Then Adler finally got to the main point. "Mr. Higgins, on the afternoon of July 4th, 2004, did you witness an interaction between Arthur Vance and his wife Evelyn?" Walter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He licked his dry lips. "Yes." "Please tell us exactly what you saw," Adler said, leaning forward. Walter took a shaky sip of water. His hand shook so much that water splashed onto his old tie. He put the glass down. "I saw them arguing," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw Arthur yelling." Adler frowned in confusion. "And what d?" It'd Evelyn do. Walter took a deep breath. He looked up, but not at me. He looked directly at Marcus, and for a split second I clearly saw Marcus nod, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion of confirmation. Walter cleared his throat. She was trying to take the boy, he said loudly. She was trying to put him safely in the car. She was crying. She said she wanted to take him to her mother's house for safety. The entire room went dead silent. I physically felt the blood drain completely from my face. That was absolutely not what happened. That was a total lie. "And what did Mr. Vance do?" Adler asked, his voice suddenly very tight. Walter closed his eyes. "He violently grabbed the boy," he said. "He grabbed him by the arm incredibly hard. He dragged him aggressively back into the house." He paused. "And then what, Mr. Higgins?" Evelyn's lawyer pressed, leaning in like a hungry vulture. "And then he took him to the garage," Walter said, his voice gaining awful strength. "He put him in the cold garage and he locked the heavy door. It was completely dark in there. No windows. That poor boy was screaming in the dark for hours. I could hear him banging desperately on the metal door. Arthur just sat on the front porch drinking a beer. He told me he had to teach the boy a harsh lesson about silence." I completely stopped breathing. The air forcefully left my lungs as if I had been violently punched in the gut. "Liar," I whispered. Walter didn't stop. He was reciting a rehearsed script now. I could clearly hear the unnatural rhythm of it. It wasn't his actual memory. It was a fabricated story someone had paid him a lot of money to tell. "He used to say the boy was permanently broken," Walter continued, gaining false confidence. "He used to say he needed to fix him like a busted car part. He kept him locked in that garage whenever he made too much noise." "That is a damn lie," I shouted, my voice booming aggressively off the glass walls. "Arthur, sit down," Adler hissed loudly, grabbing my arm. I stood up, violently knocking my heavy chair over. It crashed to the floor with a loud sound like a gunshot. "I fixed your leaky roof, Walter," I screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger at the old man. "I shoveled your snow for 15 damn years. I brought you hot soup when your wife died. How could you do this? How much did they pay you?" Walter flinched hard, shrinking back deeply into his chair. He looked completely terrified now, but not of the lie. He was terrified of me. Evelyn's lawyer shot up, holding his hands out in a mock defensive posture. "Let the record clearly show that Mr. Vance is becoming highly aggressive and physically threatening the witness." "You bought him," I roared, turning furiously to Marcus. "I know you did. You found a desperate, poor old man and you bought his damn soul." Marcus didn't flinch. He just smiled. A completely cold, dead smile. And then he did the exact one thing he knew would finally break me. He softly laughed. It was a very soft chuckle, but in that silent, tense room it sounded exactly like a bomb. I completely lost it. The rage that had been actively building for 20 agonizing years, the deep anger at the abandonment, the extreme frustration of the last week, the absolute terror of losing Julian, it all exploded at once. I didn't think. I just aggressively moved. I lunged forcefully across the mahogany table. I wasn't trying to hurt old Walter. I wanted to get to Marcus. I wanted to violently wipe that smug smile off his face. I wanted to make him, physically, feel the pain he was inflicting on my son. "Arthur, no," Adler shouted. My chest violently hit the table, sliding quickly on the polished surface. The water pitcher went flying, shattering loudly against the wall. Legal papers scattered everywhere like twisted confetti. Marcus jumped back, quickly knocking his chair into the wall. He looked scared for a brief second, and then he looked absolutely delighted. He pulled out his phone. "Security," Evelyn screamed, her voice shrill and highly theatrical. "Help, he is actively attacking us." 2 massive security guards burst into the room. One of them forcefully grabbed my left arm, the other aggressively grabbed my right. They wrenched my arms painfully behind my back. Extreme pain shot right through my old shoulders. I wasn't fighting them anymore. I had already realized my fatal mistake. As soon as my feet left the floor, I knew I had walked right into their perfect trap. I stopped struggling completely. I just hung there between the two large guards, panting heavily, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Get a picture," Marcus shouted. "Get a picture of this." I looked up. Marcus was holding his phone up high. The bright flash went off. Once, twice. I saw myself exactly through his lens. I saw exactly what the judge would see. I saw what the entire world would see. A large, incredibly angry man, violently restrained by security in a room full of expensive suits. A highly violent man, an unstable man, a man who looked exactly like the monster Evelyn had so eloquently described on television. Walter was openly crying now, real tears this time. He was visibly shaking, staring at me with deep horror. "I am sorry, Arthur," he whispered, but nobody heard him except me. I looked at Evelyn. She wasn't dramatically screaming anymore. She was casually adjusting her blouse. She looked at me with totally cold satisfaction. "Thank you, Arthur," she said very softly. "You just signed the custody papers for me." The guards roughly dragged me out of the room. I didn't look back. I didn't struggle. I felt completely cold, colder than I had ever felt in my life. I had gone there to try and save my son, and instead, I had just gift-wrapped and handed him over. I had foolishly let my anger become their ultimate weapon. As they shoved me into the waiting elevator, I realized something truly terrifying. The law doesn't care about the truth at all. The law only cares about evidence. And I had just willingly given them the absolutely perfect evidence that I was highly dangerous. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness, I could vividly see Julian. I could see him rocking anxiously in the corner, waiting for me to come home. And for the very first time in 20 years, I wasn't sure if I ever would. I had not just lost a witness. I had completely lost the high ground. And in a brutal war like this, the low ground is exactly where they bury you. The massive legal team that Evelyn had hired did not just understand the law. They knew exactly how to tell a compelling story that America desperately wanted to hear. After they failed to easily provoke me into another violent outburst, they drastically changed their target. They actively stopped aiming at the angry father and firmly turned their sights on the white wife. They fully knew that in the court of public opinion, the marriage between a beautiful 25-year-old art gallery director and a nonverbal autistic man looked highly suspicious. They did not need to definitively prove Claire was a predator. They just needed to successfully make people ask the question, why is she actually with him? It aggressively started with a blind item in a highly popular gossip column. Then it rapidly became a featured segment on a major morning news show. The headline was incredibly brutal in its simplicity. Is IT love or is it the money? They constantly showed out-of-context pictures of Claire wearing designer clothes, standing right next to Julian, who was wearing his noise-canceling headphones and looking awkwardly away from the camera. They relentlessly analyzed her body language. They brought in supposed experts, who aggressively claimed that women often target vulnerable, disabled men to gain total control of their finances. They effectively painted my daughter-in-law not as the deeply loving woman who spent months learning sign language just to communicate with her husband, but as a ruthless gold digger who had found the absolute easiest mark in New York City. I sat in the kitchen watching Claire read the horrific comments on social media. Her hands were visibly shaking. People she had never even met were aggressively calling her a groomer. They were actively calling her a leech. They explicitly said she was taking horrific advantage of a man who could not legally consent. That was the specific comment that hurt her the absolute most. The disgusting idea that Julian was essentially a child she was manipulating. They systematically stripped Julian of his manhood, and they stripped Claire of her hard-earned dignity. I sat at the worn kitchen table watching her scroll through the endless stream of online hate. She was crying silently, tears dripping steadily onto her phone screen. "They do not know us, Arthur," she whispered. "They do not know that he is actually the one who saved me." They do not know that his absolute honesty is the only thing that makes any sense in my entire life. I gently took the phone from her trembling hand and turned it completely off. They do not want to know the truth, Claire, I said. Evelyn is purposefully feeding them a toxic narrative. She is actively using his disability and societal prejudice to create a massive scandal, because a scandal creates doubt. And if the judge doubts your intentions, he will hand the guardianship straight to his. The real, devastating missile was launched 2 days later, and it was a precision strike aimed directly at the very heart of my son's fragile universe. Julian lives by a strict, unyielding set of rules. For an autistic mind, rules represent safety. Rules are the sturdy walls that keep the chaotic world out. And the absolute most important rule in Julian's life is unwavering loyalty. To him, a promise is a physical, unbreakable bond. A lie is a genuine physical injury. Evelyn somehow knew this. She knew that if she could conclusively prove Claire broke the rules, Julian's entire world would instantly collapse. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. We were desperately trying to maintain a normal routine. Julian was sitting in the living room, meticulously working on a charcoal sketch. His iPad was propped up right next to him, playing his favorite soothing ambient music. Suddenly, a direct message popped up. It was from a blocked, anonymous number. Usually we tightly screen all of his messages, but this one somehow breached the firewall as a priority emergency alert. Julian looked at the glowing screen. I physically saw his broad body go completely rigid. It was not a gradual building of tension, it was terrifyingly instant. He completely stopped breathing. The thick charcoal pencil in his hand snapped entirely in half with a sharp, violent crack. I looked up from my daily newspaper. "Jules, what is it?" He did not answer. He just stared unblinkingly at the screen, his dark eyes impossibly wide with a primal terror I had not witnessed since he was a helpless child. I quickly got up and walked over to him. I looked down at the iPad. My blood ran completely cold. It was a photograph, a high-resolution, vivid image of Claire walking intimately out of a sleek hotel room. She was wearing a stunning red dress and she was passionately kissing another man. The man was tall, handsome, and confidently holding her waist. The digital timestamp stamped on the corner of the photo was from yesterday afternoon. I knew immediately and without a doubt that it was a total fake. I knew Claire was sitting directly beside me at Adler's law office yesterday afternoon. I knew she did not even own a red dress. I knew that the artificial lighting in the photo was way too perfect, entirely staged. It was a malicious deepfake, a highly sophisticated Photoshop job specifically created by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate digital imagery. But Julian did not know anything about malicious deepfakes. Julian did not understand the modern concept that human eyes can be so easily lied to by a screen. In his strictly binary world, if there is a clear picture of an event, it is absolutely real. If it is real, then Claire is a liar. If Claire is a liar, then the core foundation of his entire life is permanently destroyed. "No, Jules," I said, urgently reaching for the iPad. "That is not real, that is a cruel trick." He violently snatched the device away from my reach. He stared at it intensely, mathematically analyzing every single pixel. To him, the visual data was conclusive and final. His beloved wife was with another man. The sacred rule was broken. The safety was gone. Claire happily walked into the room carrying a silver tray of fresh tea. "Hey guys, I made some chamomile," she said with a forced, brave smile. Julian made a sound I will absolutely never forget as long as I live. It was a low, terrifying growl, exactly like a severely wounded animal. He stood up abruptly and forcefully threw the iPad directly across the room. It smashed violently against the drywall, completely shattering the glass screen into a spiderweb of shards. "Jules." Claire gasped in horror, instantly dropping the silver tray. The ceramic mugs shattered loudly, splashing hot, steaming tea everywhere across the carpet. Julian slowly turned to look at her. His handsome face was completely twisted in sheer agony. He did not see his loyal wife anymore. He saw a dangerous traitor. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at the front door. "Go," he screamed. It was a guttural, raw, deafening sound. "Go, unsafe. You are completely unsafe." Claire took a desperate step forward, her hands reaching out pleadingly. "Jules, what is wrong? What just happened?" "Do not touch me," he roared, quickly backing away until his spine forcefully hit the wooden bookshelf. "Liar, you are a liar. The picture says you are a liar." I quickly stepped directly in between them. "Claire, he just saw a picture," I said, talking incredibly fast. "Someone anonymously sent him a highly realistic fake picture of you intimately kissing another man. He genuinely thinks you cheated." Claire's face went stark white, drained of all blood. She looked at Julian, heavy tears welling up rapidly in her eyes. "Jules, no, you know me. Please look at me. I am your Claire. I would never, ever hurt you." But it was way too late. The rigid logic loop in his autistic brain had already firmly closed. Claire equals liar. Liar equals extreme danger. Danger must be immediately removed. Julian aggressively grabbed a heavy, solid glass vase from the shelf. He held it up threateningly like a weapon. His large hand was trembling violently. "Get out," he sobbed, his chest heaving. "Get out right now or I will make the horrible noise stop." I knew exactly what that meant. He was actively threatening to severely hurt himself to forcefully stop the unbearable emotional noise exploding inside his head. Claire looked at me in a panic. She clearly saw the deep fear reflecting in my eyes. She knew she had temporarily lost him. "I will go," she whispered. Her voice completely broke into jagged pieces. "I will go, Jules, just please put the vase down." She turned rapidly and ran out of the room. I heard the heavy front door slam shut. Julian instantly dropped the vase. It did not break on the thick carpet, but it rolled away with a hollow, depressing sound. He slid slowly down the wall, tightly pulling his knees to his chest. He started violently rocking back and forth, back and forth. He began frantically reciting the Fibonacci sequence, numbers tumbling rapidly out of his mouth as he desperately tried to rebuild the shattered order of his mind. I stood there frozen in the middle of the absolute wreckage, the broken iPad, the spilled hot tea, the totally shattered trust. I realized right then that we were fighting a completely different kind of enemy. Evelyn did not just want the millions. She was entirely willing to psychologically lobotomize her own flesh and blood to get it. She knew exactly which vital wires to cut in his brain. She knew that by violently taking away Claire, she was taking away his soul translator, his emotional anchor, his only bridge to the outside world. She had successfully isolated him. First, she destroyed my public reputation so I could not protect him legally. Now she had destroyed his marriage so Claire could not protect him emotionally. He was entirely alone, just like he was when he was only 4 years old. I knelt down quietly next to him, but I absolutely did not touch him. I knew I could not magically fix this complex break with a simple wrench. I watched my son desperately counting numbers in the growing dark, and I felt a freezing, absolute resolve settle over me. Evelyn truly thought she had won. She thought that by completely breaking his spirit, she made him incredibly easy to control. But she forgot one massive thing. She forgot that when you aggressively strip absolutely everything away from a man, when you steal his safety, his love, and his peace, you do not leave him empty. You leave him with absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated rage. And Julian Vance was about to dramatically show her that his unique rage was not silent. The cheap neon sign buzzing outside the dive bar sounded exactly like a dying, massive insect. It was a filthy establishment on the gritty edge of the industrial district, the exact kind of depressing place where broken men went to actively drink away their meager paychecks and forget their own names. The floor was disgustingly sticky with spilled, stale beer, and the thick air smelled heavily of old smoke and deep regret. I sat alone in the darkest, most secluded booth in the back, my scarred hands wrapped tightly around a glass of tap water I had absolutely no intention of ever drinking. Resting on the torn vinyl seat next to me was a thick, brown manila envelope. Inside was exactly $50,000 in untraceable cash. It was my entire life savings. It was every single dollar I had securely squirreled away in the old coffee can hidden in the garage. Every extra weekend shift I had worked at the grimy lube shop. Every single penny I had painstakingly scraped together for a massive emergency. I looked down at my hands. The dark grease was permanently etched deeply into the lifelines of my palms. These were honest hands that built strong things, hands that fixed broken things, and now I was forcefully using them to do something that made me physically sick to my stomach. I was about to pay a massive bribe. I was about to pay a desperate ransom to the flashy man who had stolen my wife, just so he would leave my vulnerable son alone. The heavy door opened, letting in a brief slice of yellow street lamp light. Marcus confidently walked in. He looked exactly like a preening peacock strutting in a filthy pigsty. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that definitely cost more than the combined bar tab of everyone sitting in the room. He quickly spotted me in the shadows and smirked arrogantly. He walked over, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking obnoxiously on the filthy linoleum floor. He slid smoothly into the booth opposite me, dramatically wrinkling his nose at the terrible smell. "You picked a truly charming spot, Arthur," he said, casually brushing an imaginary speck of dust off his silk lapel. "I suppose this is your natural, pathetic habitat." I did not rise to the cheap bait. I slowly pushed the thick brown envelope across the scarred, sticky wooden table. "Take it," I said, my voice incredibly low and rough. "There is exactly $50,000 in there. It is absolutely all I have in the world. Take it and actively convince Evelyn to drop the massive lawsuit. Go back to whatever slimy rock you originally crawled out from." Marcus looked down at the fat envelope. He did not eagerly reach for it. He just stared at it with a sickening look of deep amusement. He slowly reached out with one perfectly manicured finger and lazily lifted the paper flap. He clearly saw the tight stacks of used old bills. He let the flap fall back down. 50,000, he repeated mockingly. He leaned far back in the booth and laughed out loud. It was not a happy, joyful laugh. It was the distinct sound of a wealthy man who had just found a dirty penny on the sidewalk. "You honestly think $50,000 is going to somehow fix this?" he asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "Arthur, you really are an incredibly simple man, aren't you? You genuinely think this entire thing is just about simple greed. You think we are just actively trying to get a little extra weekend spending money." He suddenly leaned forward, his face turning incredibly serious and dark. His eyes were heavily bloodshot. I saw a raw, frantic desperation hiding there that perfectly matched my own. "I owe very dangerous people a lot of money, Arthur. Bad, bad people. The exact kind of people who absolutely do not send polite lawyer letters. They send massive guys with heavy baseball bats. I owe them over $500,000. And the vicious interest is compounding heavily every single day. 50 grand would not even buy me a full week of safety." My stomach violently turned over. So that was the actual truth. Evelyn did not come back out of some twisted maternal love. She came back purely because her flashy new husband had foolishly gambled away their entire lives. "So you are actively using my disabled son as your personal piggy bank," I said, my voice visibly trembling with white-hot rage. "You are going to completely destroy his life just to comfortably pay off your mob bookie." Marcus shrugged callously. "He is currently sitting on nearly $2 million, Arthur. And that is just the absolute start. The weird kid is a literal factory. He paints, we heavily sell. It is a brilliant, simple business model. Evelyn legally controls the trust. I manage the lucrative investments, and my heavy debt magically goes away. Everyone wins, well, except you, of course." He casually reached for my water glass, took a bold sip, and grimaced in disgust. "You are truly pathetic," he sneered right in my face. "Just look at you. You are 68 years old. You live in a depressing house that is literally falling apart. You drive a rusted car that should be crushed in a scrapyard. You are absolutely nothing but a dirty, uneducated mechanic, Arthur. You have gross grease permanently under your fingernails and cheap oil running in your veins. You were never, ever good enough for a woman like Evelyn. That is exactly why she left you. She desperately wanted a real man, not a sweaty laborer." I felt the intense heat rapidly rising in my chest. It started deep in my belly and spread like wildfire to my broad shoulders. It was a deeply familiar, terrifying heat. It was the exact same heat I felt when I vividly saw the dark bruising on Julian's arm after he hit himself. "She left us because she was incredibly weak," I said through tightly gritted teeth. "She left because she absolutely could not handle the hard, exhausting work of true love." Marcus laughed again, much louder this time. A few depressed patrons at the bar actually turned around to look at us. She left you because she was incredibly bored, Arthur. And frankly, looking at you, I do not blame her one bit. And now she is legally going to take the boy back. And do you want to know exactly what we are going to do with him? We are absolutely not going to coddle him like you do. We are going to permanently lock him in a facility. A nice, highly quiet place upstate where they have strict doctors to make absolutely sure he stays highly productive. No more screaming tantrums, no more annoying sensory meltdowns, just paint and heavy medication. We will successfully turn him into the reliable gold mine he was always meant to be. The horrific, vivid image of Julian securely locked in a padded room, heavily drugged into silent submission, endlessly painting picture after picture for this vile man to sell, hit me exactly like a physical crushing blow. The entire world narrowed down to the smirking face of the man sitting directly across from me. I completely forgot Adler's careful legal plan. I forgot the strict lawyer's advice. I forgot that I was 68 years old with a bad heart. I stood up forcefully. "You will not ever touch him," I roared loudly. Marcus looked up at me, his eyes dancing with mocking delight. What exactly, old man? What are you possibly going to do? Fix my transmission?" I did not think at all. I just rapidly moved. My heavy right hand, the exact hand that had tightened steel bolts and hammered heavy metal for 50 years, clenched tightly into a massive fist. I swung with absolutely everything I had left in my body. My hard knuckles connected perfectly with the bridge of his arrogant nose. There was a sickening, loud crunch, the distinct sound of thick cartilage breaking. Marcus's head violently snapped backward. Bright red blood sprayed aggressively across the table, splattering heavily onto the brown envelope full of cash. He howled in immense pain, desperately clutching his ruined face. He fell awkwardly out of the booth, crashing heavily onto the dirty, sticky floor. I stood towering over him, breathing incredibly hard, my large hand violently throbbing. For one brief second, I felt a massive surge of primal satisfaction. I had successfully silenced the vicious voice that explicitly threatened my son, but then Marcus slowly looked up at me. Thick blood was actively pouring down his chin, completely ruining his expensive silk shirt. But he was absolutely not looking at me with any fear. He was looking at me with total, undeniable triumph. He spat out a mouthful of dark blood and grinned widely, his teeth stained completely red. "Got you," he wheezed happily. Before I could even process what his words meant, the dark room was suddenly bathed in intense, flashing red and blue light. Sirens wailed loudly right outside the bar door. They were incredibly loud. Way too loud, way too close. The front door of the dive bar burst violently open. Multiple armed police officers swarmed rapidly into the room, their guns fully drawn. "Police, get down on the ground," someone screamed loudly. I froze completely. I looked down at Marcus. I looked back at the aggressive cops, and then I finally understood everything. He knew I would hit him. He had purposefully, verbally pushed me until I inevitably did. He had the police actively waiting right around the dark corner. This was absolutely never a peaceful negotiation. It was a perfectly executed ambush. "Get down on the ground right now," the lead officer yelled again, aggressively pointing a bright yellow taser directly at my chest. Slowly, painfully, I dropped heavily to my knees on the sticky, wet floor. I put my shaking hands securely behind my head. The officer rushed forward quickly, forcefully kicking my legs apart and violently slamming my face down into the filthy floor. I instantly tasted dirt and stale beer. I felt the freezing, cold steel of tight handcuffs ratcheting painfully tight around my wrists. Marcus was gently helped up by another uniformed officer. He was holding a bloody napkin to his ruined nose, acting the part of the innocent victim perfectly. "He aggressively asked me to meet him here, officer," Marcus cried, his voice thick with fake theatrical terror. "He actively tried to bribe me to drop a custody case. When I flatly refused, he violently attacked me out of nowhere. He is a highly violent man. He is incredibly dangerous." I desperately tried to speak, to quickly tell them about the massive gambling debt, about the explicit threats to Julian, but a heavy officer pressed a hard knee directly into my spine, totally knocking the wind out of my lungs. "Arthur Vance, you are officially under arrest for felony assault and battery," the officer recited coldly. As they roughly dragged me out of the bar, right past the staring, silent patrons and into the blinding flashing lights, I clearly saw Marcus standing comfortably by the waiting ambulance. A paramedic was actively tending to his bloody nose. He locked eyes with me one last time. He proudly held up a stamped piece of legal paper the officer had just handed him. It was an emergency protective order. I knew exactly what it legally meant without even reading the fine print. It meant I was now legally documented by the state as a highly violent threat. It meant Evelyn now possessed the absolute perfect weapon to permanently strip me of my parental rights. But worst of all, it meant that I legally could not go home. I could not go within 500 feet of the victim or his immediate family. Evelyn was his legal wife. That made her immediate family, and Julian was currently trapped in her custody. The horrific realization hit me drastically harder than the police officer's heavy knee. By throwing that single punch, I had not just broken Marcus's nose. I had entirely broken the very last shield standing securely between my vulnerable son and the hungry wolves. I was going to a jail cell, and Julian was going to be completely alone with the evil people who actively wanted to sell him for spare parts. I sat miserably in the back of the freezing squad car, watching the heavy rain streak quickly against the glass. The brown envelope containing my entire life savings was still sitting on the bloody table in the bar. Gone. Everything was completely gone, and as the police car pulled rapidly away into the night, I whispered the only thing I could possibly think of. "I am so sorry, Jules. Daddy is so sorry." But the only answer I received was the lonely wail of the police siren taking me further and further away from the terrified boy who desperately needed me. The devastating consequences of my uncontrolled anger arrived formally on a piece of thick government stationery, delivered by a bored bailiff who looked like he would rather be absolutely anywhere else. I was sitting silently on the freezing metal cot in the holding cell, gently nursing my bruised, swollen hand, when Adler quickly walked in. He did not look angry with me. He just looked totally defeated. He sat down heavily on the metal bench directly across from me and placed the formal document right between us. It was a temporary emergency custody order. The probate judge had looked closely at the bloody photos of Marcus's broken nose. He had reviewed the aggressive police report describing me as highly belligerent, and he had made the absolute only decision the strict law allows in a messy situation that looks exactly like severe domestic violence. He officially granted Evelyn temporary legal custody of Julian, pending a full psychiatric evaluation of the entire family dynamic. "You played perfectly right into their trap, Arthur," Adler said, his voice incredibly tired. "You willingly gave them exactly what they needed. They expertly painted you as a highly violent, unstable old man who cannot physically control his temper, and now the court fully agrees with them. They are moving Julian today." I felt the remaining blood rapidly drain from my exhausted face. "Today?" I stood up frantically, aggressively gripping the cold steel bars of the cell. "Where exactly are they taking him?" I asked, my voice cracking wildly. "To a highly secure, state-licensed assessment facility," Adler said quietly. "It is legally considered neutral ground, or at least that is exactly what the judge calls it. But we both know Evelyn personally picked it out. It is a bleak place called Serenity Hills." I knew of Serenity Hills. It was a depressing warehouse for the unwanted. It was exactly where wealthy families parked their burdensome elderly parents and their highly difficult disabled children when they simply did not want to deal with them anymore. It was incredibly loud. It was highly chaotic. It was absolutely everything that actively destroyed Julian's delicate mind. "Get me out of here," I pleaded desperately. "I desperately need to be there. I need to slowly explain it to him. If they just abruptly show up and grab him, he will genuinely think I abandoned him. He will think I am exactly like her." Adler nodded sympathetically. "I have already posted your bail. You are technically free to go home, Arthur, but you absolutely cannot physically interfere. The police will be actively there to aggressively enforce the transfer." If you touch anyone, if you so much as raise your voice in anger, they will instantly arrest you for violating the protective order, and you will absolutely lose him forever. Do you understand me? You have to stand there quietly and watch them legally take your son, and you have to do absolutely nothing. I drove home, aggressively breaking every single speed limit in the city. My racing heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped, panicked bird. I prayed desperately that I would get there before them. I prayed that I would just have 5 minutes, just 5 short minutes, to firmly hold my boy and gently tell him that this was somehow part of a greater plan, even though I had absolutely no plan at all. I turned rapidly onto my street, and my heart completely stopped. The red and blue lights were already violently flashing. 2 police cruisers were aggressively parked right in my driveway. A large white van bearing the dark Serenity Hills logo was totally blocking the garage. I slammed hard on the squealing brakes and jumped out of the car before it had even fully stopped rolling. I ran frantically toward the house. The front door was wide open. I heard the horrific screaming long before I saw anything. It was not a normal human scream. It was the desperate sound of a wild animal caught violently in a steel trap. It was a high-pitched, continuous, agonizing wail that completely shredded the air. Julian. I sprinted wildly up the concrete walkway. A police officer quickly stepped directly in front of me, his heavy hand resting on his holster. "Mr. Vance, step back immediately," he ordered firmly. "We are executing a lawful court order." I completely ignored him. I looked desperately past his broad shoulder directly into the living room. 2 incredibly large orderlies, dressed in pristine white scrubs, were aggressively trying to pull Julian forcefully off the floor. Julian was desperately clinging to the heavy leg of the solid oak FV table. His long fingers were totally white from the strain. His face was buried deeply in the carpet. He was screaming hysterically into the wool, screaming my name over and over again in pure terror. "Daddy, daddy, daddy." Evelyn was standing casually by the stone fireplace. She was wearing dark designer sunglasses inside the house. She was absolutely not helping him. She was delicately holding a silk handkerchief to her nose, looking completely disgusted by the messy scene. "Just get him up," she snapped impatiently at the orderlies. "He is just being overly dramatic. Drag him if you have to." One of the massive orderlies, a man with incredibly thick arms, aggressively grabbed Julian tightly by the waist and violently yanked him backward. Julian's fingernails dug deeply into the solid wood of the table. I clearly heard the sickening sound of them tearing. I visibly saw dark blood violently smear on the oak wood. "Stop it!" I roared, desperately trying to physically push past the cop. "You are severely hurting him. He is deeply autistic. He does not understand what is happening." The cop shoved me backward incredibly hard. I stumbled awkwardly, but I kept my eyes locked on my son. Julian quickly looked up. He clearly saw me. His dark eyes were impossibly wide, filled with a sheer terror that I will vividly see in my darkest nightmares until the exact day I die. He reached a shaking hand out desperately toward me, his bloody fingers grasping frantically at the empty air. "Daddy, help! Unsafe! Unsafe!" I lunged forward again. I simply could not help it. My logical brain fully knew the severe legal consequences, but my breaking heart only knew that my terrified child was actively calling for my help. The officer aggressively grabbed my arm and violently twisted it painfully behind my back. He slammed me forcefully against the wooden door frame. I felt the freezing cold metal of tight handcuffs snapping securely onto my wrists for the second time in less than 24 hours. "You were explicitly warned, Mr. Vance," the officer hissed directly into my ear. I struggled desperately against the tight cuffs, hot tears streaming rapidly down my face. "I am absolutely not hurting anyone," I sobbed brokenly. "Just please let me talk to him. Please just let me calm him down." But they absolutely did not listen. The 2 orderlies physically lifted Julian completely off the ground. He kicked and thrashed violently, completely knocking over an expensive lamp. He was a very big man, strong from years of lifting heavy canvases. But against 2 highly trained, massive professionals, he had absolutely no chance. They aggressively dragged him toward the open front door. His shoes dragged heavily on the carpet, leaving a dark trail of scuff marks. He looked at me one final, devastating time as they forcefully hauled him right past the front porch. He suddenly stopped screaming. He just stared at me. And in that awful silence, I clearly saw something vital entirely break inside him. He completely stopped fighting. His large body went totally limp. He looked at me with a profound, soul-crushing betrayal. He genuinely thought I was willingly letting them do this to him. He thought I was standing there passively watching him be violently taken away because I actually wanted him to go. "I am so sorry, Jules," I screamed, my voice completely breaking. "I love you. I am coming for you. Daddy is coming." They forcefully shoved him into the dark back of the white van. I heard the heavy metal lock click shut. It sounded exactly like an executioner's gunshot. Evelyn casually walked out of the house. She elegantly stepped right over my foot as I knelt brokenly on the porch, tightly restrained by the officer. She stopped and slowly lowered her dark sunglasses. She looked at my steel handcuffs and then directly at the van. "You really should have just taken the $50,000, Arthur," she said completely coldly. "Now you have absolutely nothing." She got comfortably into her luxury car and drove quickly away, closely following the white van. The officer aggressively pulled me up to my feet. Now that the van was totally gone, the extreme tension in his grip loosened slightly. He looked at me with something vaguely resembling pity. "I am going to legally release you now, Mr. Vance," he said, quickly unlocking the tight cuffs. "But if you try to follow that van, I will have to immediately arrest you. Stay right here." He walked away, leaving me standing completely alone on the quiet porch. My wrists were severely bruised. My heart was completely shattered into dust. The house was entirely silent again, but it was a dead, hollow silence. The very soul of the house was completely gone. I sank down heavily onto the concrete steps and buried my face deeply in my scarred hands. I had utterly failed. I had promised his dying grandmother that I would always strictly keep him safe, and I had just helplessly watched him be violently dragged away, bleeding and terrified. I physically felt a crushing darkness rapidly closing in on me, a massive despair so incredibly heavy I could not even breathe. Then I felt a remarkably gentle hand resting on my shoulder. I quickly looked up. It was Claire. I had completely forgotten she was even there. She had been standing silently in the dark corner of the living room the entire horrific time, completely silent and unmoving. Her face was incredibly pale and her eyes were bright red, but she was absolutely not crying anymore. She looked exactly like a vengeful ghost. She sat down quietly next to me on the freezing concrete steps. She did not hug me. She did not offer any empty, useless words of comfort. She leaned in incredibly close, her warm lips brushing right against my ear. "Arthur, listen to me very carefully," she whispered. Her voice was pure, sharp steel tightly wrapped in velvet. I weakly shook my head. "It is totally over, Claire. They took him. He completely hates me now." "No," she hissed aggressively, grabbing my arm with incredibly surprising strength. "Listen to me, this absolutely had to happen." I pulled back, looking at her like she was completely crazy. "What the hell are you talking about?" Claire quickly looked around to make absolutely sure the police were completely gone. She lowered her voice even further. "Julian completely knew they were coming," she said. Right before the orderlies violently grabbed him, he subtly slipped something directly into my pocket, and he told me to tell you something very important. I stared at her in shock. "What?" She quickly reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavily crumpled piece of paper. It was an old receipt from the local art supply store. On the back, written rapidly in Julian's shaky handwriting, were a highly complex series of numbers, specific GPS coordinates, and 3 distinct words. "Let me handle it." Claire looked me dead in the eye with fierce intensity. "He is not a helpless child, Arthur. We have spent 20 long years fiercely protecting him from the harsh world, but we completely forgot that he constantly observes absolutely everything. He fully knew Evelyn would absolutely never stop until she legally had him physically, so he purposely let her legally take him." "Why?" I asked, my exhausted mind completely reeling. "Why on earth would he willingly go to that hellhole?" "Because," Claire whispered, a deeply dark, terrifying smile slowly touching her lips. "That is exactly where the legal evaluation happens. That is where the court-appointed doctors will officially interview him. and Julian has been aggressively preparing for this specific interview for a whole week. He is absolutely not going in there as a helpless victim. He is going in there as a highly calculated Trojan horse. She stood up confidently and forcefully brushed the dust off her skirt. Plan B is now fully active, Arthur. Now get up. We have a lot of work to do. We desperately need to find the old tax records for the trust. If Julian is actively going to blow up the entire building from the inside, we need to make absolutely sure the fire aggressively spreads directly to Evelyn's bank account on the outside. I looked blankly at the empty driveway where the van had entirely disappeared. I thought deeply about the strange look in Julian's eyes. Maybe it was not betrayal at all. Maybe it was pure, intense focus. Maybe he went totally limp, not because he tragically gave up, but because he was actively saving his energy for the real final fight. I stood up. My knees were shaking badly, but I stood up anyway. What exactly do you need me to do? I asked. Claire confidently handed me the car keys. Drive, she said firmly. We are going to effectively see the IRS. The glossy promotional brochure for Serenity Hills prominently featured a serene stone fountain and a widely smiling woman peacefully doing yoga on a lush green lawn. It cheerfully promised a holistic approach to comprehensive mental wellness. It loudly promised unyielding dignity. But the stark reality was a depressing concrete block building sitting on the absolute edge of an industrial park, tightly surrounded by a high chain-link fence completely topped with dangerous razor wire. Inside, it certainly did not smell like calming lavender and hope. It smelled heavily of industrial-strength bleach, boiled, soggy cabbage, and highly stale urine. It was a bleak warehouse for the entirely unwanted. It was the exact place where wealthy families permanently stored their burdensome, elderly parents and their difficult children when they officially became way too much of an issue to keep safely at home. And this horrific place was exactly where my highly sensitive son spent his very first night away from me in 20 years. I know exactly what horrific things happened inside those cold walls because we successfully subpoenaed the facility's security footage much later. I sat in a pitch-dark room and agonizingly watched every single second of my son's brutal torture. I saw the orderlies roughly lead him down a very long, aggressively flickering hallway. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed loudly with a terrible frequency that I fully knew sounded exactly like a dentist's drill directly in Julian's sensitive ears. He was walking incredibly stiffly, his arms pinned tightly to his sides, his terrified eyes fixed entirely on the dirty floor tiles. They absolutely did not take him to a warm therapy room. They took him directly to room 304. It was not a medical room. It was a sterile cell. There was a rigid metal bed permanently bolted directly to the cold floor with an incredibly thin, plastic mattress. There was a cold stainless steel toilet sitting exposed in the corner. The small window was heavily reinforced with thick wire mesh. The walls were painted a deeply suffocating beige that was actively peeling in the damp corners. There were absolutely no sensory toys, no comforting weighted blanket, no vital noise-canceling headphones. They had sadistically stripped him of absolutely everything that made him feel safe and human. The orderly violently shoved him completely inside and quickly closed the heavy metal door. The lock clicked loudly with a terrible sound of finality. Julian stood frozen in the exact center of the room. He did not move a single muscle. He did not rock to comfort himself. He just stood there, violently vibrating with a silent, overwhelming terror that radiated clearly off the security screen. Then the door suddenly opened again, but it was not a caring doctor. It was Evelyn. She was no longer wearing her expensive fur coat. She was wearing a highly sharp, professional business suit. She did not look anything like the weeping, tragic mother from the art gallery. Her face was incredibly hard. Her eyes were totally cold. She looked around the bleak room with a deep sneer of disgust, but absolutely not on Julian's behalf. She was clearly disgusted that she had to physically be in such a cheap, dirty place. She quickly closed the door securely behind her. There were absolutely no reporters here, no flashing cameras except the grainy, black and white security camera hidden in the corner of the ceiling. She could finally drop her flawless mask. She walked confidently over to the thin bed and sat down, casually crossing her legs. She looked intently at Julian, who was still standing rigidly like a stone statue. "Sit down," she ordered coldly. Julian did not move at all. He did not even blink his eyes. "I said sit down," she snapped loudly, her shrill voice echoing painfully off the bare walls. When he still did not respond to her, she stood up angrily and marched aggressively over to him. She violently grabbed his chin, physically forcing him to look directly at her. "You are going to completely stop this fake act right now," she hissed viciously. "I fully know you can hear me. I know you perfectly understand every single word. Your pathetic father bobbied and coddled you for 20 long years. He foolishly let you play the helpless victim. But I am absolutely not him. I am not going to gently wipe your nose and sweetly tell you it is all okay. We have a highly lucrative business to run." She aggressively let go of his face. She reached deep into a large, expensive tote bag she had brought with her. She quickly pulled out a handful of cheap, terrible brushes and a massive set of student-grade acrylic paints, the exact kind you buy at a cheap dollar store. She forcefully threw them onto the metal bed. They clattered incredibly loudly. "I brought you some supplies," she said. "You have a massive commission due on Friday. The gallery personally called me. They explicitly said the wealthy client is waiting." Julian slowly looked at the cheap, synthetic tubes of paint. To a brilliant artist who exclusively works with pure pigments directly imported from Italy, seeing those horrible synthetic colors was a massive insult. To an autistic man who desperately needed highly specific textures to even function properly, it was an absolute mockery. She quickly pulled out a flimsy canvas board and propped it up roughly against the wall. "Paint," she commanded aggressively, pointing directly at the blank white square. "Paint something incredibly colorful, something very happy. The art market absolutely loves happy." Julian did not move an inch. He just stared blankly at the blank wall sitting just above her left shoulder. He was doing exactly what he always did when the outside world became way too hostile. He was actively retreating inward. He was completely shutting down all external inputs. Evelyn waited impatiently for a full minute, then two. The heavy silence stretched incredibly tight, like a rubber band about to snap. "Pick up the damn brush," she screamed suddenly, violently kicking the heavy bed frame. Julian flinched, a tiny, barely noticeable movement, but he absolutely did not reach for the brush. "You honestly think you are special," she yelled, angrily pacing around the small, cold room. "You think just because you luckily sold one abstract painting you are a complete genius. You are absolutely nothing without me. You are just a broken, defective machine, and I am the absolute only one who knows how to properly fix you. Your father is totally gone, Julian. He is locked in a jail cell. He abandoned you exactly like I knew he would. You entirely belong to me now." She got right back in his face again, her breath practically on his skin. "We have a massive debt to pay. Do you understand me? Marcus owes very bad people a lot of money, and you are going to pay every cent of it. You are going to paint until your fingers physically bleed if you have to. I do not care if you ever sleep. I do not care if you ever eat. You are going to rapidly produce inventory." She aggressively grabbed his hand and violently tried to force the cheap paintbrush right into his fingers. Julian's hand went entirely limp. The brush fell uselessly to the floor. Evelyn slapped him. It was not a terribly hard slap, but it was incredibly sharp and degrading. On the security tape, I clearly saw Julian's head snap quickly to the side. I saw him slowly touch his red cheek. "Fine," she spat venomously. "Be completely stubborn. You will eventually get very hungry. And when you finally do, you will paint." She turned rapidly and walked out, violently slamming the heavy door behind her. Julian stood entirely alone in the suffocating silence. He slowly looked at the cheap paints resting on the bed. He looked at the discarded brush on the floor. He absolutely did not pick them up. He walked slowly over to the far corner of the room and sat down heavily on the cold linoleum. He pulled his long knees tightly to his chest, but he did not cry at all. He just stared intensely at the blank wall with a deeply frightening, calculating intensity. Night eventually came. The harsh lights in the facility dimmed slightly, but they absolutely never went out completely. The hallway light cast long, prison bar shadows directly across the floor of room 304. On the screen, I saw Julian suddenly move. It was exactly 3:00 a.m. He stood up incredibly slowly. He walked silently over to the messy pile of art supplies Evelyn had left. He totally ignored the cheap paints. He ignored the horrible brushes. He reached specifically for a small, dark stick of sketching charcoal that had accidentally fallen out of the box. He walked purposefully to the massive wall opposite the bed, the exact wall that was perfectly visible to the ceiling security camera. He started to write. He did not draw a beautiful landscape. He did not sketch a human face. He forcefully drew stark lines, straight vertical lines, then perfect horizontal lines. He was meticulously building a massive grid. Evelyn must have been actively watching him from the live monitor down in the nurse's station, or perhaps she had just come back to angrily check on her prisoner. The door abruptly opened again. She stood there in the doorway looking incredibly tired and highly angry. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked, stepping aggressively into the room. Julian absolutely did not stop. The dark charcoal scratched loudly against the rough plaster. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Evelyn walked much closer, squinting confusingly at the wall. "I explicitly told you to paint a picture," she shouted. "What is this absolute garbage? You are ruining the facility wall. They are going to charge me a lot of money for that." She aggressively grabbed his shoulder and violently spun him around. "Look at me," she demanded loudly. "Stop playing with the stupid wall and make me something I can actually sell." Julian looked at her, and for the very first time since she arrived, he actively smiled. It was not a happy, warm smile. It was an incredibly cold, totally mechanical smile. It was the exact smile of a brilliant chess player who sees mate in exactly 3 moves. He smoothly stepped aside, proudly revealing exactly what he had meticulously written. Evelyn looked closely at it. To her completely uneducated eyes, it just looked like the random, crazy scribbles of a madman. Massive columns of numbers, strange symbols, complex brackets, and precise percentages. It successfully covered 4 solid feet of the wall. "You are completely insane," she whispered, stepping back in horror. "You are actually completely insane. My son is a total freak who writes pure gibberish on the walls." She laughed, a harsh, incredibly cruel sound. "Go right ahead," she said maliciously, waving her hand dismissively at the wall. "Write your total nonsense. Tomorrow morning, the state doctors will completely see this, and they will legally lock you up here forever. And then I will easily have full power of attorney for the rest of your life. You are actively digging your own grave, you idiot." She left him there, completely alone with his massive wall of numbers. As I sat alone in that viewing room watching the tape, I felt a freezing chill violently run down my spine. I actively paused the video. I zoomed in tightly on the wall. I am highly uneducated. I am just a mechanic. But I successfully managed the complex books for my busy auto shop for 30 long years. And Claire successfully ran a highly profitable gallery. We absolutely knew numbers. Those were absolutely not random scribbles. Julian had drawn a completely perfect, flawless replica of a financial ledger. On the far left column, he had perfectly written specific dates, July 2004 to July 2024. In the exact middle column, he had written billable hours, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. In the far right column, he had written a specific hourly rate, $45 per hour. And at the very bottom, underlined 3 distinct times with the thick charcoal stick, was a massive total. It was a highly detailed invoice. Evelyn genuinely thought he was losing his fragile mind. She truly thought the immense pressure had completely broken his brain. She absolutely did not realize that while she was aggressively screaming about modern art, Julian was actively doing complex math. He was perfectly calculating the exact financial cost of her abandonment. He was strictly calculating the retroactive, legal salary of a highly specialized caregiver. He was actively building the ultimate trap. And as I watched him closely on the screen, standing confidently in the dark next to his massive calculations, I fully realized Claire was absolutely right. He was definitely not a helpless victim crying in a cell. He was a brilliant architect standing in his office. And he was meticulously designing the exact blueprint for his mother's total financial destruction. He finally put the charcoal down. He lay down calmly on the thin mattress and closed his eyes. He went asleep instantly. It was the incredibly peaceful sleep of a man who had successfully finished his hard work for the day. Outside the facility, I was sitting desperately in my car with Claire, frantically going over complex tax codes. Inside, Julian was perfectly writing the invoice. The deadly pincer movement had fully begun, and Evelyn, completely blinded by her own incredible greed, absolutely did not see the steel jaws rapidly closing around her neck. The quiet courtroom smelled heavily of cheap lemon polish and incredibly old lies. It was a stifling scent I had grown to absolutely hate over the last 3 weeks, but today the scent was deeply suffocating. I sat slumped at the defendant's table, my scarred hands folded limply on top of the scratched wood. My knuckles were still heavily swollen from violently punching Marcus, but I kept them carefully hidden. I absolutely did not want the judge to see the residual violence remaining in my hands. I specifically wanted him to see exactly what I was about to show him: a broken, exhausted old man, a totally defeated father, a useless relic who had finally run out of gas. Opposite me, Evelyn and Marcus looked exactly like absolute royalty. Evelyn was wearing a stunning, cream-colored suit that probably cost significantly more than my car. Her dyed hair was pulled back tightly in a severe bun that perfectly showed off her massive diamond earrings. She sat with her back completely straight, radiating the intense confidence of a greedy woman who has already counted the money before the massive check has even cleared. Marcus sat smugly next to her, gently nursing his broken nose, which was now covered by a small, discreet medical bandage. He looked directly at me with a sharp smirk that was practically sharp enough to cut glass. He tapped his manicured fingers casually on his expensive leather briefcase, a rhythmic, annoying sound that perfectly echoed the ticking of the clock on the wall. They truly thought this was just a formal coronation. They thought I was just here to beg for crumbs. Judge Belmont entered the tense room in a massive swirl of flowing black robes. He was an incredibly stern man with a hard face carved directly from granite. He absolutely did not look at me. He looked directly at the thick file resting in front of him. The massive file that strictly contained the formal psychiatric evaluation directly from Serenity Hills. "We are here today to make a final, binding ruling on the strict matter of the Vance conservatorship," Judge Belmont said, his deep voice booming effortlessly without a microphone. "I have thoroughly reviewed the emergency medical report submitted by Dr. Thorne directly from the evaluation facility. It is incredibly concerning." Dr. Thorne was quickly called to the witness stand. He was a very small, nervous man with rapidly shifting eyes and a gross sweat stain forming on his tight collar. Evelyn had chosen him incredibly well. He was the exact kind of corrupt doctor who solely saw patients as highly billable hours, not actual human beings. "Dr. Thorne, please concisely summarize your official endings for the court," Evelyn's slick lawyer said, standing up smoothly and buttoning his expensive jacket. Dr. Thorne nervously cleared his throat. He did not dare look at Julian, who was sitting incredibly still next to me, staring blankly at the table. "The subject, Julian Vance, clearly displays severe, irreversible cognitive regression," Dr. Thorne read loudly from his medical notes. "During his mandatory stay at Serenity Hills, he was entirely nonverbal for 90% of the time. He exhibited extreme obsessive-compulsive behaviors, specifically severely defacing facility property with completely nonsensical, manic scribbles. He showed absolutely no basic interest in standard self-care or basic social interaction. It is my strict professional opinion that Mr. Vance utterly lacks the required capacity to manage his own complex affairs or make any rational financial decisions. He desperately requires a permanent legal guardian to ensure his immediate safety and the safety of his massive estate." I listened in silence as he clinically described my brilliant son as a helpless vegetable. I listened as he successfully twisted Julian's intense focus into sheer madness. The supposed scribbles he foolishly talked about were the incredibly complex financial calculations Julian had expertly written on the cell wall. The absolute silence he mentioned was simply Julian's highly effective way of surviving the intense sensory hell they had maliciously put him in. But I did not object at all. I did not angrily slam my fist on the table. I just sat there, my heavy shoulders totally slumped, staring blankly at my hands. "Thank you, Dr. Thorne," the judge said firmly. He turned his harsh gaze directly to me. "Mr. Vance, your legal counsel has formally filed a motion to dismiss the conservatorship. You strongly claim that your son is fully capable and that you have been his sole primary caregiver for 20 years. Do you have any actual evidence to actively refute Dr. Thorne's professional medical findings?" This was the exact moment. This was the specific script we had meticulously rehearsed in the dark. Adler gently nudged my leg under the table. It was time. I stood up incredibly slowly. I made absolutely sure my wooden chair scraped incredibly loudly against the floor. I purposefully let my entire body physically sag. I actively let the sheer exhaustion of the last 20 brutal years clearly show on my face. I absolutely did not look like the angry man who had violently punched Marcus. I looked exactly like a tired man who had been totally crushed by the immense weight of the cruel world. "Your Honor," I said, my voice trembling just enough. I looked directly at Evelyn. She was watching me incredibly closely, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. She was eagerly waiting for the fight. She was waiting for the explosive anger. "I have absolutely no evidence," I said very softly. The entire room went dead silent. Even the court reporter completely stopped typing. "Excuse me, Mr. Vance," the judge asked, leaning forward in pure surprise. I looked down sadly at Julian. He was wearing an old suit I had bought for him 5 years ago. It was a little bit tight in the broad shoulders. He purposefully looked incredibly small, incredibly vulnerable. I said, "I have absolutely no evidence, Your Honor," I repeated, much louder this time. "I am just a simple mechanic. I only fix cars. I absolutely do not know anything about complex psychiatric evaluations. I do not know anything about massive trust funds or advanced asset management." I took a deep, shaky breath, actively letting a single tear leak slowly out of my eye. It was a very real tear, but it was absolutely not for the reason they all thought. "I am 68 years old, Your Honor. I am incredibly tired. My heart is really not good. I have spent every single day of the last 2 decades constantly worrying about this boy. I have fiercely fought for him. I have aggressively protected him. But maybe Dr. Thorne is absolutely right. Maybe I truly have been holding him back. Maybe I am just a deeply selfish old man who is terrified of being alone." I saw Marcus's smirk quickly widen into a massive grin. He nudged Evelyn. She looked totally shocked at first, but then a slow, incredibly greedy smile spread fully across her tightened face. They were completely buying it. They were rapidly swallowing the bait, hook, line, and sinker. "My wife left 20 years ago exactly because she clearly said I could not properly provide the life Julian desperately needed," I continued, sadly wiping my eyes with a rough hand. "She has finally come back now. She has massive money. She has endless resources. She has a husband who actually knows about advanced finance. Maybe it is finally time for me to gracefully step aside. Maybe it is finally time for Julian to actually have a mother." I looked directly at Evelyn. "You win, Evelyn," I said brokenly. "Take him, take the money, take the heavy burden. I simply can. Do it anymore." I sat down heavily, completely burying my face in my hands. The courtroom instantly erupted in loud whispers. Evelyn's expensive lawyer looked utterly stunned. He had extensively prepared for a massive legal war, and the supposed enemy had just completely surrendered before the very first shot was even fired. Judge Belmont banged his gavel loudly. "Order! Order in the court!" He looked at me with something vaguely resembling genuine pity. "Mr. Vance, are you officially withdrawing your legal objection to the permanent conservatorship?" "Yes, Your Honor," I mumbled sadly into my hands. The judge sighed heavily. He looked at the thick stack of papers in front of him. "Very well. Given the biological father's formal withdrawal and the extensive medical evidence presented, it seems the court has a completely clear path forward. But before I officially rule, I must strictly follow protocol. The subject is physically present. Mr. Julian Vance." Julian stood up. The movement was incredibly sharp and highly precise. He absolutely did not slouch. He did not nervously rock. He stood up completely straight, his spine perfectly aligned like a thick steel rod. He calmly adjusted his cuffs. Evelyn looked at him, highly annoyed. "Sit down, Julian," she hissed loudly. "The judge is talking." Julian completely ignored her. He looked directly at the judge. He made intense eye contact. For a severely autistic person, this is an incredibly difficult task, but Julian held it flawlessly. "Your Honor," Julian said. His voice was absolutely not the mumbled, terrified whisper everyone fully expected. It was incredibly clear. It was totally calm. It sounded exactly like the strong voice of a brilliant man who had spent a full week in total silence, perfectly refining his complex argument. "I would like to formally address the court regarding the complete transfer of authority." The judge looked incredibly surprised. "Go ahead, young man." "I entirely agree with my father," Julian said. He did not look at me. He kept his intense eyes strictly on the judge. "He is very old. He is very tired. He absolutely does not understand the immense complexity of the financial future that currently lies ahead of me. The Vance Art Trust has massively grown way beyond his simple capabilities." Evelyn literally gasped aloud. She happily covered her mouth with her hand. This was vastly better than she could have ever dreamed. Her wealthy son was actually agreeing with her. "I desperately require a guardian who truly understands the massive value of money," Julian continued smoothly. "Someone who is totally willing to do absolutely whatever it takes to maximize the assets. My biological mother has certainly proven that she is exactly that person. She returned after 20 years specifically just to manage my finances. She has shown incredible determination. She forcefully placed me in a locked facility to ensure I was totally compliant. She is absolutely the appropriate manager for the entire estate." He turned slowly to Evelyn. He looked her up and down. His facial expression was totally unreadable. It was a flawless mask of perfect neutrality. "I fully accept your guardianship, Mother," he said. "I completely want you to have full legal control over the Vance Art Trust and absolutely all of its associated liabilities." Liabilities. The heavy word hung completely suspended in the air for a tense second, but nobody caught it. Not the experienced judge, not the expensive lawyer, and certainly not Evelyn, who was way too busy mentally visualizing the massive balance of his bank account. Judge Belmont nodded. He looked deeply impressed. "It seems the family has miraculously reached a consensus. This is highly unusual, but it significantly simplifies matters." He picked up his expensive pen. "Mrs. Evelyn Sterling, the court officially grants your petition for permanent legal conservatorship over Julian Vance and the entire Vance Art Trust. You are hereby granted full power of attorney and absolute full fiduciary responsibility, effective immediately." He boldly signed the document. The loud scratch of the pen on the paper sounded exactly like a heavy key turning in a metal lock. Evelyn stood up triumphantly. She absolutely did not hug Julian. She quickly turned to Marcus and they literally high-fived each other. It was a deeply gross display of greedy victory. They hugged each other tightly, laughing openly. "We did it," Marcus whispered loud enough for me to clearly hear. "We are incredibly rich." The bailiff handed the officially stamped order to Evelyn. She forcefully snatched it from his hand. She held it proudly like a golden trophy. She looked at me, her eyes shining brightly with pure malice. "Thank you, Arthur," she said cruelly. "Don't worry, we will happily send you a postcard from the Hamptons." I slowly lifted my head from my hands. The fake tears were completely gone. The fake exhaustion was totally gone. I looked directly at her and I allowed myself a very small, incredibly cold smile. "You really should read the fine print, Evelyn," I said very softly. She completely ignored me. She turned to Julian. "Come on," she said, arrogantly snapping her fingers at him. "Let's go. We have a massive bank transfer to quickly make." Julian did not move an inch. He calmly reached under the table and pulled out a massive, incredibly thick black binder that he had brought with him. He placed it deliberately on the table with a very heavy thud. "Actually, Mother," Julian said, slowly opening the thick binder, "before we quickly go to the bank, we desperately need to address the very first item of business for the brand new conservator." "What on earth are you talking about?" Evelyn asked, stopping completely mid-stride. Julian pointed directly to the legal document she was proudly holding. "You are now the absolute legal owner of the trust," he said. "That legally means you own all the assets, but exactly as my father just tried to tell you, it also legally means you own all the massive debts." He smoothly slid the heavy binder completely across the table toward her. "I have meticulously prepared the very first invoice," he said. "It is extremely past due." Evelyn looked down at the binder. She looked frantically at Marcus. Marcus completely stopped smiling. "What invoice?" she asked, her voice faltering badly. "The detailed invoice for 20 years of highly specialized, 24-hour care," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of all emotion, "and the massive invoice for the abrupt termination of the previous manager." Evelyn laughed very nervously. "You are obviously joking." "I absolutely never joke," Julian said firmly. And in that exact moment, the massive steel trap finally snapped totally shut. The room felt suddenly, incredibly cold. Evelyn looked at the black binder like it was an active bomb, and she was absolutely right. It was a massive financial bomb that had been quietly ticking for 20 years, and she had just eagerly decided to cut the completely wrong wire. The bailiff had previously placed the final document on the table directly in front of Evelyn. It was a single sheet of heavy bond paper that legally represented the total, unconditional surrender of my absolute rights as a father. It was the legal key to the entire kingdom. Evelyn did not look at me. She did not look at the judge. Her greedy eyes were locked totally on the financial attachment at the very back of the file. It was the complete asset schedule. I could visibly see her pupils widely dilate as she rapidly scanned the lucrative line items, the massive bank accounts, the huge residuals from the gallery sales, the estimated high value of the current art inventory, and right at the very top, the massive number that had aggressively started this entire war, $1.8 million. She had reached into her designer purse and pulled out a flashy gold fountain pen. It was a highly showy thing, the exact kind of pen wealthy people use when they desperately want to look highly important. She uncapped it with a very sharp click. Her hand absolutely did not shake. There was absolutely no hesitation, no brief moment of moral pause where a real mother might wonder if she was doing the right thing by totally stealing her son's autonomy. There was only pure greed, pure, unadulterated, distilled greed. She signed her name with a massive flourish, Evelyn Vance Sterling. The dark ink was very wet. She signed it incredibly quickly, as if she was deeply afraid the money might magically evaporate if she took too long. Then she quickly slid the paper over to the judge. Judge Belmont picked up his heavy rubber stamp. He exhaled a long breath that smelled faintly of stale coffee and total boredom. To him, this was just another daily administrative task. Just another messy family dispute settled. Just another file to clear off his busy desk before lunch. He absolutely did not know he was actively presiding over a total financial execution. He pressed the stamp firmly down. Thud. Approved. The heavy sound echoed loudly in the quiet courtroom. It sounded exactly like a massive iron door aggressively slamming shut. Evelyn let out a massive breath she had been tightly holding. She quickly turned to Marcus. They did not kiss, but they aggressively squeezed each other's hands beneath the table. I saw the tight muscles in Marcus's jaw completely relax. He was actively doing the complex math in his head. He was happily subtracting his massive gambling debts from the huge number on that paper, and realizing he still had plenty left over for a brand new sports car. The judge slowly closed the file. "The court sincerely thanks Mr. Vance for his cooperation in this highly difficult transition," he said, looking at me without actually really seeing me. "Mrs. Sterling, you are now the court-appointed permanent conservator. You possess full, absolute legal authority." Evelyn stood up gracefully. She smiled off her expensive skirt. She looked directly at me with a massive, triumphant sneer. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said proudly. "I promise to take vastly better care of his finances than his uneducated father ever could." She quickly reached for her expensive purse, entirely ready to leave, ready to race to the bank, ready to frantically start spending. But then a horrific sound violently cut through the room. It was the awful sound of a microphone being abruptly adjusted. A very sharp, high-pitched scratch of awful feedback that made absolutely everyone wince in pain. We all quickly turned. Julian was standing completely up. He had forcefully pulled the heavy, gooseneck microphone totally across the table directly toward him. Usually, he absolutely hated microphones. He hated the awful way they artificially amplified the sound of his own breathing, but he was gripping this one with an incredibly steady, strong hand. Evelyn frowned deeply. "Come on, Julian," she snapped impatiently. "We are leaving right now." Julian absolutely did not move. He did not look at her. He looked directly at the court reporter who was already quietly packing up her typing machine. "I would like to make a formal statement for the permanent record," Julian said. His deep voice was incredibly clear. It was very deep. It was remarkably steady. For 20 long years, I had solely known my beloved son as a fragile boy of very few words. He usually spoke in fragmented sentences. He spoke in quiet whispers. He actively spoke in echolalia, endlessly repeating random phrases he heard on the television. When he was highly stressed, he went entirely mute. But the commanding voice that completely filled the massive courtroom now was absolutely not the voice of a disabled, helpless child. It was the incredibly strong voice of a brilliant man. The judge looked up, highly surprised. "Mr. Vance, the legal proceedings are officially concluded." "I am fully aware, Your Honor," Julian said smoothly. "I am absolutely not contesting the ruling at all. I am simply welcoming the brand new management." He turned his head incredibly slowly. The movement was slightly mechanical but totally fluid. He looked directly at Evelyn. He looked her right deep in the eyes. There was absolutely no fear. There was absolutely no avoidance. There was only a terrifying, incredibly icy calm. Evelyn took a nervous step backward. She looked deeply unsettled. She had successfully spent the last entire month telling the whole world he was a completely helpless child. Now he was staring at her exactly like an apex predator looks at weak prey. "Welcome to my world, Mother," he said. The heavy words hung totally suspended in the air. They were very simple words, but the incredibly dark way he said them made all the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. He absolutely did not say it with any love. He said it exactly the way a deadly spider might welcome a trapped fly to a sticky web. He raised his right hand and snapped his long fingers. It was a very sharp, commanding crack. Claire, who had been sitting incredibly quietly in the back row, instantly stood up. She was holding two incredibly large, thick black briefcases. They were very heavy. I could clearly see the intense strain in her arms as she lifted them. She confidently walked straight through the swinging wooden gate that separated the gallery from the court. Her heels clicked loudly on the floor with a strict military rhythm. She absolutely did not look at Evelyn. She walked straight to the defendant's table and aggressively placed the heavy briefcases right next to Julian. Click, click. She quickly opened the metal latches. The sound was incredibly loud in the totally silent room. Evelyn laughed nervously. A very high-pitched, manic titter that sounded totally out of place. "What on earth is this?" she asked, looking desperately at the judge for support. "Is this some kind of weird parting gift?" Julian absolutely did not smile. He calmly reached into the first briefcase. He quickly pulled out a massive stack of thick binders. They were heavy black binders, each meticulously labeled by year. 2004, 2005, 2006, all the way to 2024. He aggressively began to forcefully slide them across the table. Slide, thud, slide, thud. He forcefully pushed them directly toward Evelyn until they formed a massive, physical wall right between them. "You deeply wanted the entire estate," Julian said, his commanding voice totally flat and completely emotionless. "You fought viciously for the estate. You lied horribly for the estate. And now the court has legally given you the entire estate." He slowly picked up the final, massive binder. It was bright red. "The strict law of conservatorship is very clear," he continued. "It is a total, absolute transfer of all assets and all liabilities. You absolutely cannot take the profit without taking the massive debt. You cannot take the harvest without fully paying for the seed." "Ma." Arcus suddenly stood up. His face was stark pale. "What the hell are you talking about, kid? There is absolutely no debt. We thoroughly checked the credit reports. There are absolutely no liens on the property." Julian totally ignored him. He calmly opened the bright red binder. He turned it around so the judge could clearly see it. "Your Honor," Julian said, confidently addressing the bench. "As the brand new conservator, my biological mother is legally required to completely settle all outstanding obligations of the Vance Art Trust before she can ever withdraw a single penny for herself." Judge Belmont adjusted his thick glasses. He looked highly intrigued. "That is legally correct, Mr. Vance. Are there massive outstanding obligations?" Julian pointed an incredibly long finger directly at the document in the binder. "Yes, Your Honor. The trust has a legally binding standing contract for highly specialized, 24-hour care and advanced behavioral management, a massive contract that has been actively accruing unpaid wages for 20 long years." Evelyn's tightened face went completely white. She frantically grabbed the edge of the table. "What contract?" she whispered in terror. "The contract entirely with my father," Julian said. Claire confidently stepped forward. She quickly began to actively distribute fresh copies of the document to absolutely everyone in the room. She handed one to the bailiff. She handed one to the judge. She handed one to Evelyn's slick lawyer, who suddenly looked exactly like he had just swallowed a whole lemon. I watched Claire work. She was incredibly efficient. She was totally lethal. She handed the absolute last copy directly to Evelyn. Evelyn looked down in horror at the paper. Her hands were shaking so incredibly hard the paper rattled violently. "This is an absolute fake," she screamed, violently throwing the paper down. "You completely made this up. Arthur is his father. Father's absolutely."